Right, what we're going to do in this particular video is look at the motherboard. In front of us, what we have now are two motherboards. The one on the left belongs to the 775 family, and the one on the right belongs to the 1366 family. Now, depending on what family the motherboard belongs to, we can figure out what kind of processor can be installed. For instance, in the 775 family, the Core 2 Duo and the Core Quad processors that were released, I think it was back in 2006, 2007, around that time. Those are the type of processors that could be installed onto the motherboard on the left. That is the 775 family motherboard. The one that we have on the right is a 1366 motherboard, and the first generation i7 processors were installed on this particular type of motherboard. Apart from the i7 processors, also you had the Xeon processors that could be installed on this motherboard as well. Right, one thing you'll notice about the two motherboards that we have here is the size. Now, motherboards have a standard regarding the size in which they are built in, and this is known as the form factor for the motherboards. The one on the right, the form factor or the size specifications for that particular motherboard is known as the ATX motherboard, and most machines do come with an ATX size motherboard installed in them. The one on the left, which is slightly smaller than the one on the right, is known as an MATX motherboard, which is short for Micro ATX motherboard. These are more concise in size, and they require a smaller case. So if you're looking for a compact computer, you'd probably go for the MATX motherboard rather than the ATX one. Apart from these two sizes, we also have the ITX motherboard, which is even smaller than the Micro ATX motherboard. And conversely, you have a motherboard size that is larger than the ATX motherboard, and they are usually referred to as extended ATX motherboards or eATX motherboards. Sometimes extended ATX motherboards are also known as XT motherboards, XT-ATX motherboards, that is. Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to see various portions of the motherboard and which part is attached to which portion on the corresponding motherboards that are being displayed in front of us. So the first thing we're going to look into is where the processor is installed, and that would be in a square socket, which I'm going to zoom into right now. We're going to zoom into the Micro ATX board first of all. Now, this socket over here is where the processor is installed into. As you can see, it has a lid, and if you look on the right, we have a lever. To install a processor, what we do first of all, we insert the processor into the square socket. Then what we do, we bring down the lid on top of the processor, and we pull down this lever on the right. I don't know whether you can see properly, but over here we have a latch. So what we do is bring down the latch over here, and we bring it underneath the latch, let go. Now it's fastened into position. Right, now let's look at the motherboard to our right. That's the ATX 1366 family motherboard, and we'll zoom into we'll zoom into this particular socket. Right, slightly outwards. Now this is black in colour, so it might be more difficult to see it. At the present state it's already shut, but it works exactly in the same principle as the lid and lever that I showed just now on the micro ATX board. So I'm going to open it up. The black lever, if you can see over here. Okay, this is not latched to the lever on the side, so I can just bring it up like this, and I can bring up the lid. Let's try and be careful. There we go. And we've opened it. Now similarly, exactly the same way we closed the micro ATX CPU socket, what you do is put the processor in the right orientation into the socket, bring down the lid, bring down the lever. There's an identical latch to the other motherboard over here. Bring it down underneath the latch, let go. Now it's fastened into position. Right, so that's the CPU socket. Now if you look on the right hand side in the micro ATX board, I'm going to zoom into two yellow coloured slots that you can see. Now these are known as DIMM module sockets, and this is where you install the RAM. Okay, if you look very carefully you'll be able to see a notch. Let me see if I can zoom right into it. Over there. Right, you can see two notches in the middle of the groove. Now this is to allow us to know in which particular orientation we need to install the RAM modules into this. Now I'm going to make a full separate video of how to install the individual components onto a motherboard, and well, we're going to build a whole new computer on this test bench. So that is the DIMM module sockets, and that is where you install your RAM modules. This particular motherboard accepts DDR2 RAM modules. Similarly, let's have a look at the motherboard on the right. I'm going to zoom into the DIMM module sockets for the ATX motherboard. There we go. Now I'm not sure whether you can see it, but these two have similar notches. If you look down here, move up, they've got individual notches, and these notches tell us or allow us to install the RAM modules in the right orientation. Now I must emphasize that notches are not exactly in the middle, they are offset. So that is the principle behind having, well, ensuring that the RAM modules are installed in the right orientation. If you turn it around and try to install it, those notches will not allow the RAM modules to slip into or clip into the DIMM module sockets. Right, now that we've talked about the DIMM modules and the processor socket, we are going to have a look at the expansion card sockets over here. Now let's first look at the micro ATX. Right, I'm going to have to bring the camera backwards a bit. Right, there we go. Now I'm going to zoom in. Right, in the micro ATX motherboard, the sockets over here, starting with the black one over here, followed by the small one. These two sockets over here, these are all expansion card sockets. Now we've got different types over here. The first one, the black one over here, is a PCI Express 16X socket. This has 16 lanes in it. The second one over here is also a PCI Express socket, and the difference between the first one is its size, as you can obviously see, but this is a 1X socket. Okay, I haven't actually told you guys what they're used for. Usually the 16X sockets are used for graphics cards, but in addition to that, you get sound cards, TV tuner cards, then you've got video editing cards where you can have an external video input into the machine. All these kind of cards are available with PCI Express arrangements, so they can be used in PCI Express lanes. Now certain LAN cards are available in the 1X configuration, so it can be used, and low-end sound cards as well, for that matter, can be used in the 1X socket. I should mention over here that a card that has a PCI Express 1X configuration can be installed into the 16X socket that we've got over here, socket, slot, whatever you want to call it. But conversely, we cannot install a 16X expansion card into a 1X PCI Express slot. Well, not out of the box, that is. You could modify this particular 1X socket and convert it into a 16X socket, but that is not within the manufacturer's specification. So in doing so, you would void the warranty for this particular motherboard, but it is possible to be done. Right, below then, these two sockets or slots are PCI sockets. Now, previous to the advent of PCI Express lanes and PCI Express technology, the standard for expansion cards was PCI. And many moons ago, we used to have graphics cards that used to install into the PCI sockets. Apart from that, you used to get audio cards, used to get TV tuner cards. They all used to be installed within the PCI lanes over here. Right, so that's us done with the expansion card lanes or sockets in the micro ATX motherboard. What we're going to do now is zoom into the ATX motherboard on the right and look at the expansion card sockets that we have in that machine. So let's zoom out from there, zoom to the right. Right, now let's try zooming in. Okay, so I think that's good enough. Shall I zoom out a bit more? Yeah, so get a full view. Right, over here, what we do have is 1, 2, 3 PCI Express 16 sockets. Just below that, we've got a PCI socket over here. Then below that, we have another PCI Express 16 lane socket. Now if you look up over here, you can see two small sockets. These are the 1X PCI Express lanes. Now let me just have a quick look whether you can actually see that. Yes, you can. Okay, brilliant. So this one and this one are the 1X PCI Express sockets that are available on this particular motherboard. Okay, so that's the expansion cards dealt with for both motherboards. What do we have now next? Next, we need some way to install hard drives onto these machines. So there's two formats that are being used at the moment in which hard drives can be installed onto the computer. There are two types of hard drives. One are the IDE hard drives, and the other are SATA hard drives. Okay, so we're going to first have a look at the micro ATX board and see where exactly they are installed. So we've got the micro ATX over here. Let's zoom down. Let's see if we can get it in the middle. Yeah. Right. First of all, the two red sockets that we can see over there in the micro ATX, that's this one and this one over here. These are for SATA connections. So if you've got a SATA hard drive, be it SATA 2, SATA 3 hard drives, you can install your hard drives onto these two sockets, and it will be recognized by the motherboard. Conversely, if you've got an IDE card, IDE hard drive that is, not card, you would be installing it onto the IDE socket. Now in the micro ATX motherboard, it's this blue socket over here. So let me just turn around the motherboard so you can have a proper look at it. Turn it around. Let's see if you can see it now. Right. Zoom, zoom, zoom. There we go. That's the IDE socket that is used to install IDE hard drives. Now IDE hard drives are now more or less obsolete, so you'd probably need this socket only if you're repairing or creating or building a very old machine. So that's for the micro ATX motherboard. Now we're going to have a look at the IDE and SATA sockets for the ATX motherboard. So let me just arrange the micro ATX motherboard to its original position. Turn it around. There we go. Now let's have a look at the ATX motherboard on the right. Okay, let's zoom in. Right, we're going to first look at the IDE socket. That's this socket on the right. Okay, let's move this up a bit. There we go. Now, the IDE socket for hard drives, IDE hard drives for this particular motherboard is this one over here. This is where you would install the cable for the IDE hard drive. It's one of those flat cables that you get that are quite wide. You might recall them if you remember the computers from 10-15 years ago. You might remember those flat cables that were available, and that was actually installed onto these particular sockets over here. Right, next what we will be looking at, well, before I go further, I need to show you guys SATA connections for the ATX motherboard. I almost forgot all about that. So let's zoom out first of all. I'm going to turn this motherboard around like I did with the M80X. There we go. Right, now I'm going to zoom into the SATA sockets. There we go. Now, these sockets over here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So these 10 sockets over here are the SATA sockets, where a SATA hard drive or an optical drive for that matter could be installed. The first three that are in blue, these are SATA 2 sockets. The four white sockets that we have on the on the left hand side over here, these are SATA 3 compatible. So, well, the latest technology that's being used for hard drives is SATA 3. That is these over here, and I believe their speed is 6 gigabits per second, whereas the SATA 2 hard drives have maximum speed of 3 gigabits per second. To the left hand side, I might just point this out in advance. On the left hand side you can see a LED display in this particular motherboard. Now, high-end motherboards usually do come with this LED display, so like if you have a problem after installing parts and the computer's not booting up properly or not going into Windows or the Mac OS properly, this will show particular digits. It could be C1, C3, based on the problem that the motherboard is facing. So looking at the number that's being shown on this LED display, you can figure out exactly what the problem is. For instance, I know for a fact, for this particular motherboard, if you've got a problem in the RAM, either the RAM's not being detected or it has some faulty memory on it, or you haven't installed it properly, this LED display would show C1. If everything's fine and it boots up properly, this LED display should show FF. For motherboards that do not have LED displays, we have a beeper, a very small speaker called a beeper that can be attached to the motherboard. When your computer's in a perfect working order, in that case you'll get one small beep signifying that everything's fine. If, like in the previous case I gave an example of a faulty RAM, if you have faulty RAM, you'll get lots of beeps, lots of long beeps, like beep, 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 beep. That signifies that you have a RAM problem. Similarly, you've got various combinations of long and short beeps, and depending on how many long and how many short beeps and in what configuration they're arranged in, you can figure out what exactly is the problem with your motherboard or any of the components that have been installed on the motherboard. Right, let's zoom out now. Right, let's put this in the right orientation again. Right. Now, on many cases, you'll see that you have like external USB sockets on your case. These need to be attached to the motherboard. In the Micro ATX motherboard, let's see where we can find one socket. This socket over here, below which it says USB 5.6, is where you would attach the case USB socket to. I'm not sure whether it has any other sockets there or whether it's only one. I'll have a quick look. Having a quick look over here. Let me turn it around a bit. Right, let's try zooming into that part over there. It's just above the PCI Express 16X lane. If you can see, let's move this back a bit. Yeah. Now this socket over here is where you could also attach the external USB. Well, basically the USB front panel can be attached to this USB socket over here. Now, I believe I do have a front panel USB adapter somewhere around here. Let me just have a look. Aha, found it. Right, let me just bring it over here. Now this over here is a USB 3 adapter that goes into the front of your case. In my case it came with the case. I've got an Corsair's Obsidian 800D case, and this goes into the front of the case, and this socket over here, if I can bring it, this socket over here goes into the motherboard. In this particular case, this is USB 3, and the micro ATX motherboard is not compatible with USB, so this wouldn't plug into that particular machine. But the ATX machine that I've got on the right, it does install onto that particular model. So let's have a look at the USB sockets for the ATX motherboard. So I'm going to reorientate it, put these straight. There we go. So if we zoom into the ATX motherboard over here, these two sockets over here is where you would connect an external USB adapter to. If you look at the bottom, it says USB F, USB 1 and F, USB 2, and I stand corrected about it being USB 3 compatible. While it is compatible, the motherboard is compatible with USB 3 sockets, it does not actually have a socket for an external USB 3 adapter. If we look at the back over here, we can see over here and here, these are two USB 3 sockets over here. You can make out that they're USB 3 is because of the blue colour. That colour coding implies that it is a USB 3 socket. And just above it, these two sockets over here are USB 2. And these two are USB 2 as well. But the blue colour specifically indicates that it's USB 3. So let's zoom out again. What have we got left over here? Right, let's talk about the power connections. Now, in the previous video, I did talk about the power supply unit, and one thing I mentioned was the 24-pin ATX connector. Now on the micro ATX motherboard, it would be installed over here. Right, this socket over here is where you would install the 24-pin ATX connector, and this gives power to the entire motherboard so that it can, like, various parts can interact with each other using the internal circuitry within this motherboard. Okay, similarly, let's have a look at the ATX board. If you notice so far, the orientation is remarkably similar. Now let's zoom into the ATX board. Over here. Let's move this up a bit. There we go. Now this socket over here is where you would install the 24-pin ATX for this this motherboard over there, and the orientation is more or less identical to each other. Okay. Now I also mentioned that the CPU has an individual socket that requires power. If you recall in the previous video, we had two connectors. One was 4 pin and one was 8 pin. On the micro ATX board, the CPU power connector is actually 4 pin, so I'll have to turn the motherboard around to show you guys, because it's out in that previous orientation. So what we're going to do is zoom in now. And let's zoom. Here we go. You can see the 4 pins. Right. The socket over here, the 4-pin socket over here, is where the CPU power would go from the PSU, and it would be connected to this particular socket to give power to the CPU. Similarly, let's move this orientation again and zoom out. If we look at the ATX motherboard over here, let's try changing the orientation. This is going to be difficult to see. If I put it like this, you might be able to see. There's the heat sinks over here, sort of hiding the power connector. So I've turned it around. Let's zoom in. Now this socket over here, the 8-pin socket over here, that is where you would connect the CPU power connector to. As you can see in this particular case, it's an 8-pin configuration. Okay. Right. Let's put it back into the original configuration, or orientation that is. Right, what else do we have? As far as installing computer parts is, I think we've more or less covered the essentials. But one thing I would like to talk about is the chipsets itself. You know, when we say it's a 1366 chipset or a 775 chipset, basically the computer uses the chipsets for regulating data transfer from various parts of the computer. For instance, on the micro ATX motherboard we have, this chipset architecture is known as the Northbridge-Southbridge architecture. Okay. Now, the Northbridge is underneath this particular heatsink over here. Now, what the Northbridge does, it allows the processor to send and receive information from the RAM modules that we have over here, from the graphics cards. If you've got any graphics card installed on the PCI Express lane, that would interact with the Northbridge over here and send information to the processor. Conversely, the processor would send back information from itself to the Northbridge, and from the Northbridge it will send the information to the graphics card. So that's the Northbridge dealt with. The Southbridge over here, let's see if you can see it. No, you can't, so I need to move this slightly to the right. Okay, this particular chipset over here, this is known as the Southbridge. Now this allows various input-output devices to send and receive information to other parts. So for instance, suppose I was transferring certain information, or the computer was transferring certain information from a hard drive, for instance, to the RAM module. What it would do is send information from the hard drive to the Southbridge, from the Southbridge to the Northbridge, from the Northbridge to the RAM modules. Similarly, you know, if you want to transfer information from RAM to hard drive, it will take the opposite direction from RAM to North Bridge to South Bridge to hard drive. So that's how it works. Graphics card, like suppose you're playing a game, okay, you know, the processor renders the next frame how it's supposed to look. It sends information from the from the processor to the North Bridge, from the North Bridge to the graphics card. Now the data speed rate in the North Bridge is much faster than the data speed rate in the South Bridge. That's why input-output devices are attached to the South Bridge, because the speed required is not as fast as the speed required, for instance, sending information between processor and RAM, processor and graphics card. These need much faster speeds than input-output devices. So input-output devices, including keyboard and mouse, use the South Bridge and then transfer information to the North Bridge, whereas high-speed computer components such as the RAM and graphics cards and the processor interact via the North Bridge. So that's the 775 chipset. Now let's have a look at the ATX motherboard. Now this architecture is slightly different. Okay, what we have is similar to the North Bridge. We have an ICH chip over here, which is hidden under this heatsink over here, and similar to the South Bridge, over here we can see a heatsink. Let's zoom in. This big block over here is the IOH 10 chipset. Now it is almost identical to the way the micro ATX works. The only difference is with the i7 first generation processors, the RAM controller is actually embedded within the processor. So if you look at the North Bridge, any information that needs to go between the processor and the RAM modules does not have to go via the ICH chipset. There's a direct link between the processor and the RAM modules over here. That's as far as you need to know for now. If you need further, we'll probably deal with it in more details later on. So let's zoom out. So we've talked about CPU power, ATX power. Yeah, what else do we need to talk about? Fans, of course. Computer's worst enemy is heat. So, it's true, we need to keep our machines cool. And for that purpose, we have some certain sockets on both motherboards that allow us to attach fans to. Right, in the motherboard, the micro ATX motherboard, let's zoom in and see what kind of sockets we've got for fans. Now, if you look at the top right, on the right hand side of the RAM modules, this socket over here with 4 pins is for the CPU fan. When you install a CPU onto a motherboard, on top of that you usually install a heatsink that will allow convection of heat from the processor out into air, and a fan is usually attached to that heatsink. And basically those 4 pins that we see over here, these 4 pins, is where this fan is connected to. Now processors usually are embedded with a heat probe, so the motherboard, according to the temperature of the processor, increases or decreases the speed of the fan. The higher the temperature, the faster the fan goes, and that is regulated using these 4 pins over here. Now apart from that, you can have other system fans attached. This micro ATX card does not have that many. In fact, System fans, it only does have one. Let me see if I can zoom into that one. The socket or the pin, the 3-pin connector that we have zoomed into, that is for a system fan. Okay. Right, let's have a look at the system fans and the CPU fan connector for the ATX board now. Okay. The CPU fan on the ATX motherboard is on the left hand side of the DIMM module sockets. So if I zoom in, zoom. Right, this particular 4-pin connector socket, well, you can't call it socket because they're protruding out. This is where the CPU fan is attached to. Right, apart from the CPU fan, you also have quite a few system fan connectors. One I can see right next to the ATX power connector socket. You can see it from here, so let's zoom into that one over here. There we go. That's one system fan connector. There's another one right next to the SATA sockets. You can only see 2 pins, so let's try to turn it a little bit. So let me zoom out. Let's first turn it a bit so we can see it properly. Let's try that again. There we go. That's another socket where you can connect a system fan. Let me have a look if there's any more. There should be. Right, so we've already seen this one and that one, and this one over here. There was one more somewhere around it. Ah, there you are, you little bugger. Now this is going to be difficult to zoom into, but there is one more. It's... if you see those 2 capacitors over there, just on top of it, I'm trying to zoom as far as I can over here. Right. This particular 3-pin connector over here, that's also for a system fan. So those are the 3 that I can see out of the box. Another thing I would like to talk about is BIOS. BIOS is an EEPROM chip which looks into the basic input output of both systems. It actually does, BIOS is an abbreviation of basic input output system. Now on the Micro ATX, the BIOS chip, I believe, is this socket over here, and for the ATX board, let me just have a proper look. Right, for the ATX board over here, we have 2 BIOSes. In case one fails, it also has a backup BIOS. So that is these 2 sockets over here. This is the master BIOS, that is the backup BIOS in here. So if something goes wrong with the master BIOS, you've always got the backup BIOS to back up the whole machine. Usually the first thing it will try to do when it sees there's a problem with the master BIOS is to flash the master BIOS with data it has installed within itself. If the master BIOS is entirely fried, what it will do, it will bypass the master BIOS and all interactions will start taking place with the backup BIOS over here. So that's BIOS talked about. The last thing I'd like to talk about is the connectors that we use to connect the power button, the reset button, the LED light, the hard drive LED display, the power LED button that usually you find with the power button. For the micro ATX, I'm going to have to turn this around again. Let's put this in this orientation. Yeah. So if you zoom in, these pins are used for connecting the power button, the reset button, the hard drive activity LED, and if you're going to attach a speaker to it, the beeping speaker, not actual audio speakers, but the beeping speaker I was talking about earlier, that would go into those sockets over there. Right, usually it's a good practice to have the manual with you to know which pin goes to which socket, but if you do really look closely, they do have a diagram over here, but it's really tiny writing, so the best option is really to go for a manual so that it's easy readable. If you don't have a manual, then you might have to use a magnifying glass to look into what it says which. Like over here, if you look carefully, the first two pins, the top two pins on the left hand side, that is where the LED display will go. The bottom two pins on the left hand side, that is where the hard drive LED would go. The right two pins on the top side, top right hand side, that's where the power button would go. And the bottom two pins, omitting the one on the extreme right, is where the reset button would go. And in this particular case it does not have a speaker connection. Okay, well, no option for that. And usually what you see in cases like that, if it's an old motherboard, it might already have the beeping speaker embedded within the system, within the circuit board. Okay, now if you look at the ATX motherboard, I'll zoom into where you connect the buttons, the power buttons, etc. And that is, let's move this up a bit, there we go. That is this enclosure over here. You've got many pins in there, and if you look closely below, it does actually tell you what goes where, but you can't see it because the writing is really small. As I said before, the best option is if you could download the manual, user manual, operation manual for that particular motherboard, failing which you will have to actually zoom in properly or use a magnifying glass to look at what pin goes where. So I guess that is the motherboard dealt with. I'm not going to really talk about the input-output connectors on the back of the motherboard, which is exposed at the back of the case, because that's standard and I'm sure you know about them already. So that's all we have about the motherboard. Okay.